My name is Claire, and for 9 years I sat at the same desk in the same office, working for the same man who once told the entire boardroom that I was, and I quote, the best decision his son ever made. I want you to remember that line. Hold on to it, because by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly how little those words meant to him. This is the story of how my father-in-law fired me in front of 43 employees, a room full of clients, and my own husband, and how 11 days later, 2 federal agents walked through the front doors of the company he built with his bare hands and ended everything he thought he was untouchable for. But I'm not going to start there. I'm going to start at the beginning, because you need to understand who Richard Whitfield was before I tell you who he became. I met Daniel Whitfield when I was 26 years old, working as a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm that handled audits for construction companies across the state. Daniel was an engineer, quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who noticed when you were having a hard day before you said a word about it. We dated for 2 years before he brought me home to meet his family, and I remember being nervous, because by then I already knew the Whitfield name. Everyone in our city did. Whitfield Construction Group wasn't the biggest firm in the state, but it was respected. Richard Whitfield had built it from a single excavator and a handshake with the city back in the 80s, and over 3 decades, it had grown into a company that built schools, bridges, water treatment plants, the kind of infrastructure that quietly holds a city together. Richard was proud of that. He talked about it constantly. We don't just pour concrete, he used to say at every dinner, every holiday, every family gathering. We build the bones of this city. The first time I met him, he shook my hand a little too hard, looked me directly in the eyes and said, "So you're the accountant. Not nice to meet you. Not Daniel's told us so much about you. Just, you're the accountant." As if that was the only thing about me worth noting. I should have paid more attention to that moment than I did. But I was 28, in love, and eager to be liked by the family I was about to marry into. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, was warmer, at least on the surface. She hugged me, told me I had a lovely smile, asked about my parents. Sophie, Daniel's younger sister, barely looked up from her phone. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was just nerves on her part. I would later learn that Sophie didn't look up for anyone unless they could do something for her. Daniel and I married 18 months later. It was a small wedding, nothing extravagant, though Richard made sure everyone at the reception knew that Whitfield Construction had built half the venues in this city, gesturing vaguely at the room as if he'd personally laid every brick of the hotel ballroom we'd rented. Eleanor cried during the toasts. Sophie left before the cake was cut, and Richard, in his speech, said the line I'll never forget. "Claire is the best decision my son ever made," he said, raising his glass. And frankly, the company could use someone with her head for numbers. I remember Daniel squeezing my hand under the table, beaming, thinking his father had just paid me the highest compliment he was capable of giving. I believed it too, for a while. I didn't yet understand that Richard Whitfield only complimented things he intended to eventually own. 6 months after the wedding, Richard offered me a position at Whitfield Construction Group as Director of Financial Controls. It was a real promotion from where I'd been working, better pay, more responsibility, and the chance to build something alongside my new family. Daniel encouraged it. Eleanor said it would be wonderful to have me close. Even I, cautious as I tend to be, couldn't find a good reason to say no. I said yes. And that decision, taking that job, walking into that building 5 days a week for the next 9 years, would end up being the most consequential choice of my adult life. Not because of what I built there, but because of what I eventually found buried inside it. I want to be honest with you about something before we go further. This isn't a simple story about a cruel father-in-law and an innocent daughter-in-law. It's more complicated than that, and more true because of it. For most of those 9 years, Richard wasn't cruel to me. Not in any way I could point to and say, "There, that's the moment he turned." It was slower than that. It was quieter. It crept in through small comments, small dismissals, small moments where I was reminded again and again that no matter what I did for that company, I would never be considered part of its real bloodline. By the time I understood what Richard Whitfield actually was, I had already found the first irregularity in the books. And by the time he stood up in front of the entire company and told everyone I was being let go for performance issues, I had already spent 8 months quietly building a case that would end his career, his freedom, and the empire he spent 30 years convincing this city he deserved. But we'll get there. First, you need to understand how a woman who spent nearly a decade keeping that company's books honest ended up being the one humiliated in front of everyone she worked beside. Stay with me. This story moves slowly until it doesn't. For the first 3 years at Whitfield Construction Group, I genuinely believed I had found a place where I belonged. My job was, on paper, straightforward. I oversaw the company's internal financial controls, budgets, vendor payments, contract compliance, the constant flow of numbers that kept a construction company with government contracts running cleanly and legally. Whitfield Construction didn't just build private developments. A significant portion of our revenue, nearly 40% some years, came from public infrastructure contracts, municipal water systems, school renovations, road resurfacing projects funded partially through state and federal grants. That detail matters. Remember it. I was good at my job. I don't say that with arrogance. I say it because it's simply true, and because it matters to the rest of this story. I caught discrepancies before they became problems. I built reporting systems that made audits faster and cleaner. I trained 2 junior accountants who are still there today, doing excellent work. Richard would occasionally walk past my office, glance at whatever report I had open, nod once, and keep walking. That nod was the closest thing to praise he offered most weeks. I told myself it was enough. Daniel and I settled into our life. We bought a modest house 20 minutes from his parents. We had Sunday dinners at the Whitfield estate, a sprawling property Richard had built himself naturally, as a monument to everything he'd accomplished. Eleanor hosted those dinners with a kind of theatrical warmth, always asking about my work, always telling me how proud she was that I'd found my place in the family business. Sophie came when it suited her, usually with a new boyfriend or a new business idea Richard would fund without blinking. That's the other thing you need to understand about Sophie. She held the title of Vice President of Business Development at Whitfield Construction Group, a title Richard had created for her 2 years after I started. To this day, I'm not entirely sure what her actual job consisted of. She attended client lunches. She had a corner office with a view of the river. She was, by every account I ever witnessed, the least competent senior employee at the company, and also the only person whose last name guaranteed her safety. I didn't resent her, not at first. I told myself it wasn't my business how Richard ran his company or treated his daughter. I had my own work, my own quiet satisfaction in doing it well, and a husband who, unlike his father, genuinely saw me as an equal. For a long time, that felt like more than enough. The first crack came during my 4th year, during what should have been a routine quarterly review. I had identified a vendor account, a material supplier called Fern Cross Aggregate, that had submitted 3 invoices in a single quarter for nearly identical amounts, each one rounding suspiciously close to a budget approval threshold that didn't require a secondary sign-off. It wasn't damning on its own. Construction accounting is messy by nature, full of legitimate coincidences. But it was the kind of pattern that, in my training, you flag and you ask about. I brought it to Richard directly, the way I always did with anything outside standard procedure. It's probably nothing, I told him, but I wanted to flag it before the audit. 3 invoices, same vendor, all just under the approval line. Richard looked at the printout I'd handed him for maybe 4 seconds. Ferncross has worked with us for 15 years, he said. I trust them more than I trust a spreadsheet. Then he handed the paper back to me and changed the subject to whether Daniel and I were planning to come to the lake house that weekend. I let it go. I told myself he knew the vendor relationship better than I did, that 15 years of business history outweighed a junior pattern in the numbers. I was, in hindsight, doing exactly what he wanted me to do, trusting his judgment over my own observations, because he was Richard Whitfield, and I was still, even after 4 years, the accountant. That pattern repeated itself, in different forms, for the next 4 years. A flagged anomaly here, a dismissed question there. Always with the same casual confidence, the same gentle redirection. Richard had a particular gift, and I want to give him credit for this, because understanding it is important. He never raised his voice, never seemed defensive, never gave me a single reason to think he was hiding something. He simply made every concern I raised feel small, premature, unnecessary. He made dismissal feel like wisdom. Meanwhile, the small humiliations kept accumulating, the way water erodes stone, invisible until you notice the shape has changed entirely. At a company holiday party during my 6th year, Richard introduced me to a city council member as Daniel's wife. She handles some of our books. Some of our books. I had, by that point, restructured the company's entire internal audit process. I had personally caught and corrected an error that would have cost the company a 6-figure penalty on a state contract. I was the books, in every meaningful sense. But to Richard, in front of someone whose opinion mattered to him, I was a vague secondary detail attached to his son. At a board dinner during my 7th year, Sophie presented a business development initiative that was, by every metric I understood, a poorly researched expansion plan that would have put the company dangerously over-leveraged. I raised concerns in the meeting, calmly, with data. Richard thanked me for my caution, in a tone that made the word sound like an insult, then approved a scaled-down version of Sophie's plan anyway, praising her vision in front of the entire board. I went home that night and cried in the car before I went inside, not because I was hurt exactly, but because I finally understood something I'd been avoiding for years. In Richard Whitfield's company, competence was never going to be enough. Bloodline was the only currency that mattered, and I would always, no matter what I built or fixed or saved, be standing just outside the family ledger. Daniel, to his credit, never treated me that way. When I told him about these moments, he was angry on my behalf, more than once offering to talk to his father directly. I always asked him not to. I told myself I didn't need Richard's approval, that my marriage and my work were 2 separate things, that I could simply keep doing my job well and let that be its own quiet victory. I believed that, mostly, until my 8th year at Whitfield Construction Group. That was the year I found something in the Ferncross aggregate account that I could no longer explain away as a coincidence, no matter how many times Richard told me to trust 15 years of business history over a spreadsheet. That was the year everything started, even though it would take another 14 months before anyone outside that office knew it. It started, as these things often do, with a number that simply didn't add up. I was preparing the year-end reconciliation for our municipal contracts division, the part of the company that handled public infrastructure projects funded through state and federal grants. Part of my job involved cross-referencing material costs reported to the grant oversight bodies against our internal procurement records. It was tedious work, the kind most people would never choose to do for fun, but I had always found a strange comfort in it. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. They just wait quietly to be checked. Ferncross Aggregate appeared again. 4 years after my initial flag, the vendor was still active, still billing the company regularly, still somehow never quite reaching the threshold that would trigger a secondary review. But this time, I wasn't looking at a single quarter. I was looking at 4 years of history side by side. What I found made my stomach drop in a way I still remember physically, even now. Ferncross Aggregate had billed Whitfield Construction Group for material deliveries, gravel, sand, reinforced steel, on 23 separate municipal projects over 4 years. I cross-referenced 11 of those projects against the public procurement records the city had on file, the ones available to any citizen who knew where to look. On 6 of those 11 projects, the material quantities Ferncross billed us for were significantly higher than what city inspectors had logged as actually delivered to the site. Not slightly higher. In one case, nearly double. I sat at my desk for a long time after that, staring at two spreadsheets open side by side, trying to find an innocent explanation. Maybe the inspectors had underlogged deliveries. Maybe there was a separate storage arrangement I didn't know about. Maybe Ferncross was billing for materials used across multiple sites in a way that wasn't being tracked cleanly. I wanted, badly, to find a boring explanation, because the alternative was a thought I wasn't ready to have yet. The alternative was that someone at Whitfield Construction Group was billing the government for materials that were never delivered, and pocketing the difference. I didn't go to Richard this time. I want to be clear about why. It wasn't dramatic suspicion in that first moment. It was simpler than that. I had brought him a much smaller version of this exact concern 4 years earlier, and he had waved it away in under 10 seconds. I told myself I needed more before I brought it to him again, because if I was wrong, I would only be confirming his quiet belief that I overreacted to spreadsheets. And if I was right, I needed to understand the full shape of it before I said a single word out loud. So I started looking more carefully, quietly, on my own time mostly, after hours, when the office had emptied out and it was just me, a desk lamp, and 4 years of procurement records. What I found over the following weeks built a picture I didn't want to see. Ferncross Aggregate, it turned out, was registered to a holding company called Meridian Supply Partners. Meridian Supply Partners, according to public business filings I pulled on my own laptop at home, listed its registered agent as a law firm 2 floors above Richard's golf club. The same law firm, I would later learn, that had handled Richard's personal estate planning for over a decade. I am not, and was not then, a forensic investigator. I was an internal controller with a good eye for patterns and access to records most employees never thought to cross-reference. But even with my limited scope, the pattern was becoming difficult to explain away as coincidence. A vendor with inflated billing on government contracts connected through a holding company to a law firm with a personal relationship to the company's founder. I didn't sleep well for most of that month. Daniel noticed. He asked more than once if something was wrong at work, and each time I told him I was just tired, dealing with year-end numbers, the usual seasonal stress. I hated lying to him, even by omission, but I genuinely didn't know yet what I was looking at, and I refused to drag him into a half-formed theory about his own father. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I did not want to be right. I did not go looking for a way to destroy Richard Whitfield. For 8 years, I had absorbed his small dismissals, his casual cruelties, the way he diminished my work in every room that mattered to him. And despite all of that, some part of me still wanted, badly, for this to be a misunderstanding. I wanted to find the boring explanation. I wanted to bring it to him quietly, let him fix it discreetly, and go back to simply being underestimated rather than implicated in something far worse. That isn't what happened. 3 months after I first noticed the pattern, I finally found the document that changed everything. A single internal memo, filed in a drawer I wasn't technically supposed to have access to, but which I found while helping prepare materials for an unrelated audit. It was a handwritten note on Richard's personal letterhead, addressed to no one, dated almost 6 years earlier. It read, in its entirety, Ferncross, keep margin consistent. MSP handles the rest. Nobody looks past the top line. I read that sentence maybe 20 times that night, sitting alone in my car in the parking garage, engine off, hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. Nobody looks past the top line. I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that Richard wasn't simply tolerating a flawed vendor relationship. He had built it. He had designed a system specifically engineered to be overlooked by anyone who didn't dig as deep as I had just dug. And I understood something else, sitting in that parking garage. If I brought this to him directly, the way I had brought him every concern for the past 8 years, I would not be raising a flag he'd quietly fix. I would be telling the architect of the scheme that I had found his blueprint. I didn't go inside that night. I drove home, sat in my driveway for almost an hour, and finally called the only person I trusted enough to tell the truth to. Not Daniel. Not yet. I called my college roommate, Priya, who had become an attorney specializing in whistleblower and fraud cases after law school. I hadn't spoken to her in almost a year. When she answered, I said only one sentence before my voice broke. I think I found something I can't unsee, and I don't know what to do with it. Priya listened to me for almost 2 hours that night, mostly without interrupting, occasionally asking a precise question that helped me organize the chaos in my own head into something resembling a coherent timeline. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I've carried with me ever since. Claire, I need you to understand 2 things right now. First, what you've described, if it's accurate, is serious. Federal program fraud, potentially false claims against government contracts, possibly conspiracy depending on who else is involved. This isn't a workplace dispute. This is the kind of thing that involves real investigators and real consequences. Second, and I need you to really hear this, you cannot do anything else on your own from this point forward. Not one more late night digging through drawers. Not one more conversation with Richard. If this is what it looks like, the way you protect yourself, and the way you protect the case, is by doing everything by the book, with documentation, and eventually with the right people involved, not alone. I asked her what the right people meant. She explained patiently the world I had no idea existed. The False Claims Act. Whistleblower protections for employees who report fraud involving federal funds. The possibility, which she was careful not to promise, only to mention, that if my information led to a successful recovery of misappropriated federal funds, whistleblowers could, in certain circumstances, receive a portion of that recovery. She said it almost as an afterthought, clearly more focused on protecting me than on any financial outcome. But I want to be honest with you about that detail, because it's part of this story too. I didn't do what I eventually did for money. But I'd be lying if I said the possibility didn't cross my mind during the loneliest nights of the following year. What Priya made clear, more than anything, was the importance of patience and process. Federal investigations, she explained, move slowly by design. Evidence needs to be solid before agencies act, because acting too early on incomplete information can tip off the people involved and let them destroy records, move money, or simply stop the behavior long enough to claim it never happened. If I wanted this handled properly, and not as some impulsive confrontation that Richard could spin, deny, or bury with his lawyers, I needed to be patient in a way that frankly terrified me. How long are we talking about? I asked her. Could be months, could be over a year, she said. I won't pretend that's easy to hear. But Claire, if you go in there tomorrow and confront him, or quit in protest, or do anything dramatic, you lose every piece of leverage you currently have. Right now, you're the only person who knows what you know, and you're still inside. That access is valuable. Use it carefully, or don't use it at all. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I had to sit with it for a long time. I was being asked to go back into that office every single day, sit across from Richard Whitfield at Sunday dinners, smile at Eleanor's compliments, watch Sophie get praised for ideas she barely understood, all while quietly building a case that would, if everything went the way Priya outlined, eventually destroy the family business my husband had grown up believing in. The hardest part, by far, was deciding what to tell Daniel. I went back and forth on this for almost 3 weeks. Part of me wanted to protect him from the weight of it entirely, to carry this alone the way I'd been carrying the small humiliations for years. But Priya was firm about one thing. Daniel needed to know enough to protect himself, both legally and emotionally, even if I couldn't tell him every detail of an active legal process. I told him on a Tuesday night, after Sophie had canceled on family dinner for the 3rd week in a row, and Daniel had made a tired joke about how nothing in his family ever changed. I remember the joke landing differently than he intended, because in that moment, I knew something was about to change permanently, and he had no idea. I didn't tell him everything. I couldn't legally, not yet, not with an active matter forming. But I told him I had found serious financial irregularities at the company, that I had consulted an attorney, and that I needed him to trust me without asking me to explain every detail right now. Daniel is, and has always been, a better man than his father. He didn't demand details. He didn't panic or accuse me of overreacting. He sat with it for a long moment, and then he asked the only question that mattered to him. Is this going to hurt you? Legally? Professionally? Are you going to be okay? I told him I didn't know yet. I told him that was exactly why I needed his support without his interference, at least for now. He agreed, though I could see what it cost him. The quiet recognition that whatever I had found, it likely involved his father, and that he was choosing to stand with me before he even knew the full shape of what that meant. That conversation, more than almost anything else in this story, is the reason I survived the following 14 months with any sense of myself intact. Because what came next wasn't a single dramatic confrontation. It was something slower, and in some ways harder. An entire year of going to work every day, sitting in meetings with a man I now understood was actively defrauding public infrastructure funds, and saying absolutely nothing, while I quietly, carefully, built the kind of case that couldn't be dismissed in 10 seconds. I started keeping a separate, secured log of everything: dates, document numbers, conversations, anything Priya advised me to document. I worked with a forensic accountant she connected me with, a woman named Renata, who specialized in exactly this kind of pattern analysis. Renata helped me understand that what I'd found wasn't an isolated scheme. Over a 6-year period, the inflated billing through Ferncross Aggregate and Meridian Supply Partners had likely diverted somewhere between $2 and $4 million in federal and state infrastructure funding into accounts connected, eventually, back to Richard Whitfield himself. $4 million. From schools, from water systems, from roads that families like mine drove on every single day, never knowing that some of the money meant to make them safer had quietly disappeared into a shell company 2 floors above a golf club. I carried that number into every Sunday dinner for the next year, smiling at Eleanor's compliments, nodding at Richard's stories about building the bones of this city, watching Sophie pitch half-formed ideas that her father funded without question, all while knowing, with absolute certainty, exactly how those bones had really been paid for. I want to tell you what it actually felt like, day to day, to know what I knew and say nothing. It wasn't constant fear, the way you might imagine. Fear, in my experience, doesn't sustain itself at a high pitch for 14 months. It settles into something quieter, more like a low hum underneath everything else. A hum you eventually almost stop noticing, except in specific moments that bring it sharply back to the surface. There were ordinary days where I genuinely forgot, for an hour or two, the weight of what I was carrying. I'd be deep in a routine budget reconciliation, focused entirely on catching a rounding error in a contractor invoice, and for that hour, I was simply Claire, the director of financial controls, doing the job I'd always been good at. Then Richard would walk past my office, nod once the way he always did, and the hum would return instantly, sharp and cold, reminding me that the man I just nodded back to had built an elaborate scheme to steal from the public he claimed to serve. The hardest moments were the ones involving genuine warmth. Eleanor calling to ask if I wanted her recipe for the dish I'd complimented at dinner. Richard, in a rare, unguarded moment, telling a story about Daniel as a child that actually made me laugh. Those moments destabilized me more than any confrontation could have, because they reminded me that the people I was building a case against weren't cartoonish villains in my mind. They were people who had, in their own limited and complicated way, also been kind to me. Holding both truths at once, that Richard could be warm at a dinner table and simultaneously responsible for diverting millions from public infrastructure, required a kind of internal split I hadn't known I was capable of until I had no choice but to learn it. Renata, the forensic accountant, became my closest ally during this period, even though we could only meet outside the office, usually in a coffee shop 2 towns over, where no one from Whitfield Construction would recognize either of us. She taught me how to gather documentation without leaving footprints, how to request reports through normal channels that wouldn't raise flags, how to photograph documents on my personal phone rather than printing or emailing anything traceable, how to build a timeline so airtight that no defense attorney could later claim it was speculation or a personal vendetta. The biggest risk to you right now, she told me once, isn't getting caught looking. It's getting impatient and acting before the case is ready. People who rush whistleblower cases out of anger usually end up with cases that get dismissed on technicalities, and they lose everything: their job, their credibility, sometimes even legal protection, for nothing. The patient version of you is the one who wins this. I held on to that advice like a lifeline through some genuinely brutal months. Around the 10-month mark, something happened that nearly broke my resolve entirely. Richard called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon, and for one terrifying moment, as I walked down that hallway, I was convinced he somehow knew. My hands were cold. My pulse felt audible in my own ears. It turned out to be about something else entirely, a minor compliance question related to an upcoming audit, nothing connected to Ferncross or Meridian at all. But sitting across from him in that office, answering routine questions while my entire body braced for an accusation that never came, I understood viscerally just how fragile my position really was. One wrong word, one slip, one moment of visible panic at the wrong time, and 14 months of careful work could collapse instantly. I went home that night and told Daniel I needed a few days where we simply didn't discuss work at all, where I could just be his wife and not the person quietly building a federal case against his father. He gave me that space without question, taking me away for a long weekend to a cabin we'd rented years earlier on our anniversary, somewhere with no cell service and nothing to do but walk, cook simple meals, and remember who I was outside of all of this. That weekend mattered more than I can fully explain. It reminded me that whatever happened next, I had a life and a marriage that existed independently of Richard Whitfield's choices. I wasn't only the woman building a case. I was also still simply Claire, someone's wife, someone's friend, someone who liked long walks and bad puns and quiet mornings with coffee. Holding on to that identity, separate from the investigation consuming so much of my attention, turned out to be the thing that kept me steady enough to finish what I'd started. By month 12, Priya and Renata both agreed the documentation I'd gathered, combined with Renata's forensic analysis, was strong enough to formally submit. We worked with a federal whistleblower attorney Priya brought in, a calm, methodical man named Walter Greer, who had handled several False Claims Act cases involving public construction fraud. Walter reviewed everything for nearly 3 weeks before telling me, in his characteristically understated way, "This is one of the cleaner documentation trails I've seen in this kind of case. You did the hard part. Now we let the right people do theirs." The formal report, including everything Renata and I had compiled, was submitted confidentially to federal investigators roughly 13 months after I first found that handwritten note in Richard's drawer. Walter explained that from this point forward, the timeline was entirely out of my hands. Federal investigations into program fraud could take additional months to develop independently. Investigators would need to verify our findings, potentially issue subpoenas for bank records, possibly involve additional agencies depending on which funding sources were implicated. "You may be waiting a long time before anything visible happens," Walter told me. "Possibly even longer than you've already waited. I need you to be prepared for that, and I need you to keep behaving exactly as you have been, completely normal, completely unremarkable. Give them no reason to suspect anything is different." I had no idea, sitting in Walter's office that day, that I would only have to wait 11 more days before something happened. I had no idea that those 11 days would end with Richard Whitfield standing in front of the entire company, humiliating me publicly in a way he thought would finally, permanently, put me in my place. I had no idea that his own arrogance, in that single moment, would end up accelerating everything he was trying so desperately to prevent. Whitfield Construction Group's 40th anniversary gala had been planned for almost a year. Richard had insisted on an elaborate celebration, a rented ballroom downtown, nearly 200 guests including city officials, longtime clients, vendors, and every employee across all 3 of the company's offices. It was, in every sense, meant to be Richard's moment. 40 years since he'd started with a single excavator. 40 years of building, as he loved to remind everyone, the bones of this city. I almost didn't attend. By that point, 13 months into a process that had quietly consumed nearly every corner of my internal life, the idea of standing in a ballroom celebrating Richard Whitfield's legacy felt almost unbearable. But Daniel needed to be there, and skipping it entirely would have raised exactly the kind of attention Walter had warned me to avoid. So I went, in a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and I smiled, and I made small talk with vendors I recognized from contract files I'd spent over a year quietly investigating. The first half of the evening passed almost normally. Richard gave a long speech about legacy, about the importance of family, about how Whitfield Construction wasn't just a company, but a promise to this city that we keep showing up. I stood near the back with Daniel, clapping at the appropriate moments, while internally cataloging the irony of every sentence. It was near the end of the formal program, during what was supposed to be a brief segment recognizing senior staff, that everything shifted. Richard had a microphone. He'd been drinking, not excessively, but enough to loosen whatever filter normally tempered his cruelty into something more socially palatable. He moved through a list of acknowledgments, praising 2 senior project managers, thanking the office staff, making a joke about Sophie's fresh energy that drew polite laughter from people who clearly understood the joke was generous. Then he said my name. And of course, Richard said, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom, we have to talk about our director of financial controls. I felt Daniel's hand find mine instinctively, the way it always did when he sensed something was about to go wrong. Claire's been with us for 9 years, Richard continued, and for a moment, foolishly, I thought he might actually be about to say something kind. 9 years of, let's say, very cautious bookkeeping. A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the crowd. I've gotten a lot of memos over the years, a lot of flagged invoices, a lot of concerns about vendors I've trusted for 15 years. He looked directly at me as he said this, and something cold passed behind his eyes that I had never seen directed at me before. Frankly, it's exhausting to run a growing company when someone's constantly second-guessing relationships that have served this business well for decades. The room had gone uncomfortably quiet. I felt every eye in that ballroom shift toward me. So I think, Richard said, raising his glass slightly, almost theatrically, it's time for some fresh oversight in that department. Effective immediately, Claire will be stepping down from her position. I want to describe what that moment felt like, because I think it matters for understanding everything that happened next. It wasn't simply humiliation, though it was certainly that. Being fired, publicly, with no warning, in front of 200 people, by a man who had just spent his entire speech talking about family and legacy. It was something stranger than humiliation. It was the surreal experience of being punished, in real time, for exactly the thing I had spent 13 months quietly proving was true. Richard didn't know what I knew. I understood that immediately, even through the shock. If he had known about the federal report, about Renata, about Walter Greer, he never would have done this in a room full of witnesses. He would have handled it quietly, through lawyers, through a severance agreement laced with non-disclosure clauses. This wasn't a man eliminating a threat he understood. This was simply Richard Whitfield, after 9 years of small dismissals, finally deciding I had become inconvenient enough to discard in the most public way available to him, with no idea that the inconvenience he was trying to erase had already set something irreversible into motion. I didn't cry. I want to be honest that I came close, but something in me, some instinct sharpened by 13 months of careful patience, simply refused to give him that. I stood there, in my navy dress, in front of 200 people, including city officials, who had no idea their public infrastructure money had been quietly bleeding into a shell company for 6 years, and I said nothing at all. Daniel, beside me, was visibly shaking with anger. He started to move forward, and I gripped his hand hard enough to stop him. "Not here," I whispered. Please, not here. Sophie, I noticed, was smiling faintly near the bar, the particular smile of someone enjoying a moment she'd clearly hoped for, without ever having the spine to engineer herself. Eleanor's face, by contrast, had gone pale, her eyes flicking nervously between Richard and me, as if even she understood that something about this moment had crossed a line her husband usually managed to avoid in public. Richard moved on quickly to closing remarks, thanking everyone for attending, raising his glass one final time to 40 more years. The band started playing again. Conversation slowly resumed around the room, though I could feel the lingering awkwardness, the careful way people avoided looking directly at me as Daniel guided me toward the exit. In the car, in the parking garage, Daniel finally let his anger surface fully. "I'm calling him right now," he said. "This is insane, Claire. He can't do this, not like that, not in front of everyone." "Daniel," I said quietly, "I need you to trust me on something, the same way you've trusted me for the past 13 months without asking for details. Please don't call him tonight. Please don't say anything to him yet. I promise you, I will explain everything very soon. But not tonight." He looked at me for a long moment, clearly fighting every instinct telling him to defend his wife immediately and loudly. Then finally he nodded. "Okay," he said. "I trust you. But Claire, what is going on? What do you know that I don't?" I took a breath, looked at my husband in the dim light of that parking garage, and said the only thing I could say honestly. "I think we're about to find out together. I just don't know exactly when." I had no idea, sitting in that car, that the answer was 11 days. The 11 days following the gala were, in some ways, harder than the entire 13 months that preceded them. I had no job to go to for the first time in 9 years. I had no access to the systems I'd spent so long quietly documenting. I had, in effect, lost my vantage point at exactly the moment when I most wanted to understand what was happening inside that building. Walter Greer, when I called him the morning after the gala to tell him what had happened, was characteristically calm. "This doesn't change the case," he told me. "Everything you submitted was already complete and already in the hands of investigators. Your termination, frankly, may end up working in your favor. It removes any argument that you had ongoing access to manipulate or influence anything, and it strengthens the picture of someone who reported wrongdoing and was retaliated against, even if the investigators weren't aware of the retaliation timing specifically." "Retaliated against," I repeated. "Is that what this was?" "I can't say definitively without more information," Walter said carefully, "but from what you've described, a public, sudden termination immediately following over a year of internal scrutiny, you'd applied to specific vendor relationships. That pattern is exactly the kind of thing whistleblower retaliation protections exist for. We'll explore that separately, in time. Right now, focus on yourself. Let the investigation run its course." Easier said than done. The hardest part of those 11 days wasn't financial anxiety, though that was real too. Daniel and I had savings, but losing my income still meant adjusting our entire near-term planning. The hardest part was the silence, the not knowing. After 13 months of being the only person actively moving a hidden truth toward the light, I suddenly had nothing to do but wait, the same way everyone else in my life was waiting. Except I alone understood what we were all actually waiting for. Eleanor called me 4 days after the gala. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Claire," she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I want you to know I didn't agree with how Richard handled that. I told him so, that night, after we got home. It wasn't right, doing that to you in front of everyone." I didn't know, in that moment, how much Eleanor genuinely understood about what was coming. I still don't know, fully, even now. But I appreciated the gesture, fragile and imperfect as it was. "Thank you for saying that," I told her. "I mean that." "Is everything all right?" she asked. "You seem, I don't know, different somehow, calmer than I'd expect." I chose my next words carefully. Eleanor, I think there are some things about to come to light that none of us fully understand yet. I can't explain more than that right now. But I want you to know that whatever happens, it isn't about hurting this family. It's about something much bigger than any of us. She was quiet for a long moment. You sound like you're trying to warn me about something. Maybe I am, I said softly. I'm sorry I can't say more than that. Sophie, predictably, didn't reach out at all during those 11 days. Daniel later told me she'd posted something vaguely celebratory on social media the night of the gala, something about fresh starts and new chapters for the company, which she deleted within 48 hours for reasons that would soon become very clear to all of us. Daniel and I spent most of those 11 days simply existing alongside each other in a strange limbo, him going to work each day at his own engineering firm, completely unconnected to his father's company, while I filled my days with long walks, half-hearted job searching that I knew, somewhere in my gut, I wouldn't need to take seriously for long, and quiet conversations with Walter and Priya about what might come next. On the 9th day, Renata called me, her voice tighter than usual. I can't share details, she said, but I've heard, through channels I trust, that investigators have moved faster than typical timelines on this. I think you should be prepared for something to happen soon, possibly very soon. How soon? I asked. I genuinely don't know, she said. Days, maybe. I just wanted you to be emotionally prepared, whatever happens. I didn't sleep well for the next 2 nights. Daniel noticed, of course, the way he always noticed everything about me. And on the 10th night, sitting together in our kitchen at nearly midnight, I finally told him everything. I told him about Ferncross Aggregate and Meridian Supply Partners, about the handwritten note in his father's drawer, about Renata's forensic analysis revealing somewhere between $2 and $4 million in likely diverted federal and state infrastructure funding over 6 years, about Priya and Walter and 13 months of careful, frightened, deliberate patience. Daniel sat in absolute silence through almost the entire explanation, his face moving through something I can only describe as a controlled collapse. Disbelief, then anger, then a kind of grief I hadn't expected. The grief of a son realizing the version of his father he'd believed in for 35 years had perhaps never fully existed. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "You carried all of that alone, for over a year, while he humiliated you at every turn, and you said nothing, because you were protecting something so much bigger than either of us." I wasn't trying to hurt you, I said quietly. I want you to know that. I never wanted this to be about hurting you or your mother. I know, he said, his voice rough. I know that, Claire. He reached across the table and took my hand. I'm angry. I'm angry at him, not at you. I'm angry that you had to carry this alone for so long. But I am not angry at you for doing what was right. We sat together in that kitchen for a long time after that, neither of us speaking, simply existing in the strange, heavy quiet of a truth finally shared between us. 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning, everything changed. I wasn't there when it happened. I'd been let go 11 days earlier, after all. There was no reason for me to be standing in that lobby on a Tuesday morning. But I heard about it from 3 different people within the same hour, each account slightly different in detail, but identical in substance. At approximately 10:15 in the morning, 4 vehicles arrived at Whitfield Construction Group's main office. According to Marisol, one of the junior accountants I'd trained years earlier, who called me almost immediately afterward, 6 federal agents entered the building, presented identification and a search warrant to the front desk, and requested that all employees remain in the main lobby while they secured specific offices and file rooms. It was completely silent, Marisol told me, her voice still shaking slightly over the phone. Nobody said anything. They just walked through, very calm, very organized, like they'd done this exact thing 100 times before. They went straight for Richard's office, the finance archive room, and 2 server rooms in the back. Richard, according to multiple accounts, was in his office at the time. One agent knocked, entered, and asked him to step into a separate conference room. He emerged roughly 20 minutes later, escorted, his face described by more than one witness as completely white, any trace of his usual booming confidence entirely gone. He was not, I want to clarify for accuracy, arrested on the spot that day. The agent's immediate purpose that morning was executing a search warrant connected to a federal investigation into program fraud involving false claims on municipal infrastructure contracts. But the message, to anyone watching, was unmistakable. Boxes of files were carried out over the following 3 hours. Computers were removed from 2 offices. Richard sat in that conference room for the better part of the day, accompanied by an attorney who arrived within the hour, while federal agents methodically worked through records I had spent 13 months helping them know exactly where to find. Sophie, according to Marisol, had locked herself in her office almost immediately and didn't emerge until the agents left for the day. I learned all of this in fragments, over the course of that single surreal Tuesday, while sitting in my own living room, unable to focus on anything else. Daniel came home early from work, having received a panicked call from Eleanor sometime around noon. We sat together on the couch, the television on but muted, neither of us really watching it, simply processing the strange reality that something I had spent over a year quietly building had finally, irreversibly, become real and visible to the entire world around us. Walter called me late that afternoon. "I can't comment on specifics of an active investigation," he said carefully, "but I think it's safe to say you should expect significant developments in the coming days and weeks. I want you to be prepared for media attention, potentially. Cases involving public infrastructure fraud, especially ones with a recognizable local company name attached, tend to draw coverage." He was right. By that evening, a brief item had already appeared on a local news website, vague, careful, citing sources familiar with the investigation, confirming only that federal agents had executed a search warrant at Whitfield Construction Group's headquarters as part of an ongoing inquiry into the company's municipal contracting practices. No names beyond the company itself were mentioned yet. That would change within days. Eleanor called that night, her voice barely holding together. "Claire," she said, "do you know what's happening? Please, if you know anything, I need to understand what's happening to my husband." I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment, feeling the full weight of 13 months condense into this single conversation. I thought about every Sunday dinner, every recipe she'd shared, every small kindness she'd shown me over 9 years, weighed against everything I now knew about what that family's wealth had actually been built on for at least the last 6 of those years. "Eleanor," I said finally, as gently as I could manage, "I think it's best if Richard's attorney explains the details to you and Daniel directly, when he's able to. But I want you to know something. Whatever comes out in the next few weeks, it isn't going to be a misunderstanding. I'm so sorry. I know that's not what you want to hear." She was silent for a long moment. Then quietly, almost to herself, she said, "You knew. Before the gala. You already knew, didn't you?" "Yes," I said simply. "I knew." "And he fired you anyway, in front of everyone, while you already knew?" "Yes," I said again. There was a long pause, filled with something I couldn't quite name, grief, perhaps, or the slow, painful arrival of understanding. "He has no idea what he did, does he?" Eleanor finally said. It wasn't really a question. "No," I said softly. "I don't think he does. Not yet." He would understand fully, within the next several weeks, as the investigation expanded, as additional records were subpoenaed, as the true scope of 6 years of diverted public funds became impossible to deny or explain away. But that night, sitting in my living room with my husband beside me, I understood that the quietest, most patient year of my entire life had finally, irreversibly, become loud enough for the whole city to hear. In the weeks that followed the search, the full scope of what investigators uncovered became public in stages, the way these things usually do. First through cautious news reports, then through formal charging documents, and eventually through a federal indictment that named Richard Whitfield directly. I want to walk you through what was ultimately revealed, not to dwell unnecessarily on the details, but because understanding the full scale of it matters for understanding why what happened next felt less like simple vindication and more like something heavier, a complicated mix of relief, grief, and a strange, hollow kind of justice. The investigation confirmed what Renata's forensic analysis had outlined in our original report, and then expanded considerably beyond it. Ferncross Aggregate, operating through the shell entity Meridian Supply Partners, had inflated material billing on at least 19 municipal infrastructure projects over a 6-year period, not the 11 I had originally been able to cross-reference with limited public records, but 19, once investigators gained access to full internal company records through the search warrant. The total amount of misappropriated public funds, according to the federal indictment, exceeded $3.7 million. More than that, investigators found something I hadn't been able to access during my own research: direct evidence connecting funds from Meridian Supply Partners to a series of personal accounts and investment vehicles controlled by Richard, including a property purchase 2 states away that had never appeared in any family conversation I'd ever been part of. Whatever Richard told himself this scheme was for, it hadn't simply been about company growth or covering payroll during lean years. A significant portion of the diverted funds had gone directly into his own personal wealth, separate entirely from the business he claimed, in every speech I'd ever heard him give, to have built as a promise to this city. The indictment charged Richard with conspiracy to commit federal program fraud, multiple counts of making false claims against the government, and money laundering related to the movement of funds through Meridian Supply Partners. He was not, I want to be clear, immediately taken into custody in the dramatic way television often portrays these moments. He was processed, released on conditions pending trial, and required to surrender his passport, a detail Daniel told me with a strange, exhausted laugh. My father, who spent 30 years bragging about building this city's bones, now can't even leave the state. The company itself, Whitfield Construction Group, entered a kind of organizational freefall in the weeks following the search. Several major municipal clients suspended active contracts pending the outcome of the investigation. 2 senior project managers, good people I had worked alongside for years, resigned rather than continue working under the cloud of an active federal case. Sophie, I learned through Marisol, attempted briefly to position herself as the company's interim leader, but board members, many of whom had built their own reputations on association with Whitfield Construction's prior credibility, quickly moved to bring in an outside executive to manage the crisis instead. I felt no satisfaction watching the company collapse, despite everything. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's an important and often overlooked part of stories like this one. Whitfield Construction Group employed hundreds of people who had nothing to do with Richard's scheme: honest project managers, hard-working crew members, junior accountants like Marisol, who had built genuine careers there. Watching that institution crumble under the weight of one man's greed wasn't satisfying. It was simply sad, in a heavy, complicated way that didn't fit neatly into the revenge narrative I might have imagined years earlier, in angrier moments. What I did feel, increasingly, in the weeks following the indictment, was something closer to validation, not loud or triumphant, but quiet and steady, the way truth feels when it finally settles into a shape everyone can see clearly. 9 years of being called the accountant, instead of being introduced by name. 9 years of careful work dismissed with a single nod in a hallway. 13 months of carrying a truth no one else could see, while being humiliated publicly by the very person that truth would eventually destroy. All of it finally made sense to everyone, not just to me. Walter called a few weeks into the unfolding case to share something he said I deserved to hear directly. The False Claims Act includes provisions for whistleblowers whose information leads to a successful recovery of misappropriated federal funds, he reminded me carefully. Given the strength and completeness of what you and Renata documented, and given that your report substantially initiated and shaped this investigation, you may be entitled to a percentage of whatever the government ultimately recovers once the case concludes. I don't want you to count on a number yet. These things take time, and the percentage depends on several factors. But I wanted you to know that possibility remains on the table. I sat with that information quietly for a long time after the call ended. Not because the money didn't matter. It absolutely did, particularly after 11 days, and then several more weeks, without an income. But because the number, whatever it eventually turned out to be, would never feel like the actual point of any of this. The point, if there was one single point I could identify clearly, was simpler than money. It was the basic, fundamental relief of no longer having to carry a truth alone. 3 months after the search, I received an unexpected text message from Eleanor. She asked if I would be willing to come to the house, just the family, for what she called one last Sunday dinner before everything changes for good. I almost said no. Daniel, when I showed him the message, looked equally uncertain. But after talking it through, we decided to go, partly out of respect for Eleanor, who I genuinely believed had done nothing wrong beyond marrying a man whose true nature she'd only fully understood, perhaps, around the same time the rest of the city did. Richard was not at the dinner. By that point, he'd moved into a rented apartment closer to his attorney's office, the family estate having become the subject of a separate civil forfeiture proceeding connected to the criminal case, given that investigators believed a portion of the misappropriated funds had gone toward its construction years earlier. Eleanor was, in effect, hosting what might be the last dinner in a house she might not be able to keep much longer. The dinner was quiet, heavier than any Sunday dinner I'd attended in 9 years, but also, strangely, more honest than most of them had ever been. Sophie arrived late, as always, though her usual confidence had been replaced by something brittle and uncertain. She'd lost her position at the company entirely. The new interim leadership had eliminated her role within weeks of taking over, citing, diplomatically, organizational restructuring. At one point during dinner, Sophie looked at me directly for what might have been the first time in 9 years of family gatherings. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "The whole time? About what he was doing?" "For about 13 months," I said honestly, "before he fired me." She absorbed that for a long moment. "And you just kept coming to dinner, kept smiling at all of us, knowing what you knew." "I did," I said. Because the alternative was confronting him directly, with no proof, and watching him destroy the evidence and discredit me before anyone could verify a single thing I'd found. I chose to be patient instead. I'm not going to apologize for that. Sophie didn't respond to that directly. Instead, after a long silence, she said something I hadn't expected. "I always thought you looked down on me, for my position at the company, for getting things I didn't earn." "I didn't look down on you," I said carefully, choosing honesty over comfort. "I think I felt sorry for you sometimes, watching you get praised for things that weren't real, knowing it would eventually catch up with all of us in some form. I just didn't expect it to catch up quite like this." Eleanor, sitting at the head of the table where Richard usually sat, listened to this entire exchange without interrupting. Toward the end of the evening, as Daniel and I were preparing to leave, she walked me to the door alone. "I want to say something to you," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond, because this isn't easy for me." I nodded and she continued. "I spent 38 years married to a man I loved, who I also now understand built a significant part of his confidence, his charm, his entire public identity, on things that weren't true. I don't know how to hold both of those realities at once yet. I'm still learning how." "That sounds incredibly hard," I said honestly. "It is," she said. "But Claire, I need you to know, what you did wasn't wrong. I understand now, looking back, Exactly how he treated you for 9 years. The small comments, the dismissals, the way he never once, in 9 years, said your name without some kind of qualifier attached to it. I was there for all of it, and I told myself it was just his way, that it didn't really mean anything. I was wrong about that, the same way I was apparently wrong about so much else. She paused, her composure visibly costing her something to maintain. What you did took more courage than I think any of us, even Daniel, fully understand. You could have stayed quiet forever. You could have simply left the company after he humiliated you and walked away with your dignity intact, and no one would have blamed you for that. Instead, you stayed inside something that was actively hurting you for over a year because you believed the truth mattered more than your own comfort. I don't think I've ever known anyone who did something quite that selfless. I didn't know what to say to that. I simply hugged her, for a long moment, in the doorway of a house that wouldn't belong to her family much longer, and told her I was sorry for everything she was going through, even as I understood it had been built on something that needed to come apart. That was the last Sunday dinner I ever attended in that house. Within 4 months, the property was formally included in the civil forfeiture proceedings, and Eleanor moved into a smaller home closer to her sister, 2 states away. Sophie, last I heard through Daniel, had taken a position at an unrelated company, starting, for the first time in her adult life, somewhere near the bottom, rather than at a level her father's name had purchased for her. Richard Whitfield's case took just over a year to reach a resolution. He ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced charges as part of a negotiated agreement, conspiracy to commit federal program fraud, and 1 count of money laundering, with several other charges dismissed in exchange for cooperation and restitution. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution covering a significant portion of the misappropriated funds, though Walter told me, with characteristic understatement, that full restitution in cases like this is rare, given how money tends to move once it leaves an account. I didn't attend the sentencing. Daniel did, alone, and came home that evening quieter than I'd seen him in months. He looked smaller, he told me simply. I don't know how else to describe it. Like all of it, the confidence, the speeches about building bones, it all just drained out of him somewhere along the way. I felt hearing that, not triumph, but a strange kind of sad completion, the way you might feel finishing a long, difficult book you'd been reading for years. Relief that it was finally over, mixed with an unexpected grief for the version of the story you'd once hoped it might become. In the months following the search warrant, my own life had moved forward in ways I genuinely hadn't anticipated. The new interim leadership at Whitfield Construction Group, working to rebuild the company's credibility with city officials and remaining clients, reached out to me directly about 6 weeks after the initial search, asking if I would be willing to consult on rebuilding their internal financial controls from the ground up. I said no, initially, still too raw from everything that had happened. But after some consideration and several long conversations with Daniel, I eventually agreed to a limited consulting role, helping design oversight systems specifically intended to prevent exactly the kind of scheme Richard had hidden for 6 years. It felt, in a strange way, like the most complete form of justice available to me, not punishing Richard further, which the federal system was already handling, but helping ensure the company he'd built, and the hundreds of honest employees who depended on it, could continue forward on a foundation that was actually solid, rather than one quietly held together by fraud. The whistleblower compensation Walter had mentioned months earlier eventually came through as well, 18 months after my initial report, once the case formally concluded and restitution began. The amount, while I won't share the specific figure, was substantial enough to fundamentally change Daniel's and my financial position. We used a portion of it to pay off our mortgage entirely. We used another portion to establish a small scholarship fund at the local community college for students studying accounting and forensic finance, a decision that felt, to both of us, like the most meaningful thing we could do with money that had, in its own complicated way, originated from a scheme that hurt the public trust in the first place. I eventually took a new position at a different company entirely, a mid-sized engineering firm with no connection whatsoever to the Whitfield name, working again as a director of internal financial controls. My new employer, during the interview process, asked directly about the gap in my employment history and the public case connected to my previous role. "I'd like to understand what happened," the hiring manager said, "in your own words." I told her, simply and honestly, "I found something serious. I reported it through the proper channels, even though it cost me personally, and even though the person responsible publicly humiliated me before any of it became public knowledge. I'd make the same decision again, every time, regardless of the cost." She hired me within the week. Daniel and I are still married, still building our life together, though the family gatherings that once defined so much of our weekends have permanently changed shape. Eleanor and I speak occasionally, mostly through brief, careful messages, the kind exchanged between two people who share a complicated history neither of them fully knows how to navigate yet. Sophie reached out once, almost a year after everything settled, simply to say she hoped I was doing well. I told her I hoped the same for her, and meant it, despite everything. Richard, as far as I know, remains in federal custody, somewhere in the second year of his sentence. Daniel visits occasionally, a complicated act of love I don't fully understand but deeply respect. I have not visited, and I don't know if I ever will. Some bridges, once they reveal what they were truly built upon, simply aren't meant to be crossed again. I think about that gala often, more than I expected I would. I think about standing in that navy dress, in front of 200 people, listening to a man I'd spent 13 months quietly investigating tell an entire room that my caution was exhausting, that my career with his company was over, effective immediately, while he raised a glass to 40 more years of a legacy he'd already begun secretly hollowing out from the inside. I think, too, about the version of myself who almost confronted him directly, years earlier, the very first time I noticed something strange in the Ferncross aggregate account. If I had done that, if I had walked into his office that day and demanded answers instead of quietly building a case over 13 patient months, I have no doubt he would have found a way to discredit me, to bury the evidence, to ensure that whatever truth I'd stumbled onto disappeared along with my career and my reputation. There's a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't look like strength at all in the moment it's happening. For 13 months, I sat across dinner tables from people who didn't know what I knew, absorbed public humiliation from a man who thought silence meant weakness, and told almost no one in my life the truth I was carrying. From the outside, I imagine it looked like passivity. It felt most days like the hardest, most active choice I'd ever made. I want to leave you with something I've thought about often since all of this settled into the quieter shape it now occupies in my life. Richard Whitfield spent 30 years building a public identity around the idea that he was a man who built things that lasted: bridges, schools, water systems, the literal bones of a city he claimed to love. What he actually built, underneath all of that, was something far more fragile, held together by the simple, arrogant assumption that no one paying close enough attention would ever truly look. He was wrong about that. Not because I was looking for revenge, or because I wanted to destroy him out of anger for 9 years of small cruelties. I was simply willing to look closely, to be patient, and to trust that truth, given enough time and enough care, eventually finds its way to the surface on its own. He fired me in front of 200 people, certain that doing so would finally, permanently silence the only person inside that company who had ever truly seen him clearly. 11 days later, the silence he was so confident he'd secured arrived at his door wearing a federal badge instead. If there's a lesson in this story beyond the obvious satisfaction of watching arrogance meet consequence, I think it's this. You don't always need to raise your voice to be heard. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply keep your eyes open, document what you find, trust the people equipped to help you, and wait, patiently, for the truth to become too solid for anyone to dismiss with a single dismissive nod in a hallway. Richard Whitfield once told an entire ballroom that I was exhausting, that my caution wasn't worth his time. He was right about one thing, in the end. My caution wasn't for his comfort. It was never meant to be. It was for the truth, and for every person whose tax dollars built roads and schools and water systems that were supposed to be solid all the way through. In the end, that caution outlasted everything he built. And I think, more than any single moment of public vindication, that's the part of this story I'm most at peace with. Thank you for listening.